How do you know if your fantasy story idea is actually good? Most authors will tell you, oh, ideas don't really matter, any idea can be turned into a good story if you're skilled enough, but I think that's bad advice. Because if you start with a weak idea, it puts flaws into your story right from the beginning, and you might only discover those flaws months later when you're in the middle of your first draft. See, after working with hundreds of writers in my programs to help them develop their fantasy novels, I've seen that it is so much easier to write an incredible book when you start with a strong story concept. This makes you more excited to write, and it makes readers more eager to pick up your book. So today, I want to share with you the 7 elements of a great fantasy story idea. And to explain the first element, I want you to imagine that you have 3 different ideas you're currently trying to pick from. Idea 1 is something you thought about yesterday. Idea 2 is something you thought about a couple of weeks ago. And idea 3 is something that you've been daydreaming about for an entire year. Which one of these 3 story concepts should you pursue? Well, generally speaking, I would say that the longer you've been thinking about a story, the stronger it probably is. So I would probably pick idea 3. I call this subconscious stickiness. And the logic behind this is that if you have been thinking about a world, a character, or a plot for a really long time, it's probably deeply interesting to you. That increases your chances of it continuing to be interesting while you're actually writing your first draft. And if it's been stuck so firmly in your subconscious for all this time, then there's a very good chance it's going to resonate with your readers as well. Now, does this mean that you have to wait for an entire year before you take an idea and you start writing? Of course not. But if you have been thinking about a story for a long time, maybe take this as a sign to start doing some more serious development. Now, the second element of a strong fantasy story idea is that it is similar but different. Let me explain what I mean and why this is so important, because writers get this wrong all the time. It is very common for me to hear writers say, this story I'm working on is like nothing else, it's completely original, it's completely unique, no one has ever done this thing I'm doing. But ironically, thinking of yourself as being that original, it often holds you back. Because the reality is, most of the time when writers say this to me, it's because they haven't actually mapped out the literary terrain surrounding their idea. They don't understand that there are actually a bunch of other stories doing very similar things to what they are trying to achieve. And quite often my role is to come in and gently say, hey, you should maybe check out this other thing because you probably aren't aware of it, but it is doing something similar to what you're working on. And I don't say this in a disparaging way. I say this because the writers I work with, who have the best story concepts, they actually can tell me what their stories are inspired by. Or they can point out books or movies or video games that are similar to the project they're working on. And that is actually so critical, because your goal is not to have a unique concept for uniqueness's sake. You could have a book that only uses the letter E and the letter A. That is a unique story concept. But I don't think it would make for a strong story. See, when you can understand where your sources of inspiration are, or how other authors have approached a similar story to the one that you are writing, it gives you this tremendously powerful ability to know what aspects of your readers' expectations to fulfill, and what aspects to subvert or maybe zag away from. For instance, in my own space fantasy novel, Across the Broken Stars, it pretty much has the same plot as Logan, the 2017 Wolverine movie. You've got this jaded cynic who has to help this young girl get to a mythical safe haven that may or may not exist. That is the similar part. But the different part is that it is set in a space fantasy world, and there are some other tricks and twists I pull off, leveraging from the reader's familiarity with this type of plot. If you look at this diagram here on my screen, from a reader's perspective, what a reader is often seeing is something that feels familiar to the stories they love, because that's what gets them in the door, but they are also hoping that within that familiarity, you can do something different and surprising at the same time. This is why The Boys was such a huge hit when it came out, because at the time, superheroes were everywhere, and at least in most mainstream entertainment, they usually operated within particular bounds. Yet The Boys takes our familiarity with characters like Superman and asks the question, what if Superman was an insecure little dick? And from that, the show created one of the best villains of this century in Homelander. Or to give another example, the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rocchio clearly takes a lot of initial inspiration from Dune by Frank Herbert. Both are space fantasy novels about a young man who slowly becomes a legendary figure. But it goes in a completely different direction, because Dune's core idea is that messiahs are bad and lead to a lot of destruction, whereas Sun Eater argues kind of the opposite, that sometimes a messiah is genuinely needed in order to save humanity. And as a quick sidebar here, I was recently on the Two to Ramble podcast to discuss the Sun Eater series in its entirety, now that the whole series is finished. I'll link to that in the description down below if you want to check it out because it was a really good conversation. So to conclude this point, for you to come up with a truly strong story idea, I think it is so important that you can clearly articulate what stories your project is similar to and in what ways you are diverging or playing with those sources of inspiration. That blend between familiarity and strangeness, that is the path to true creativity. Now, the third element of a strong fantasy story idea is a very tricky one to pull off, but when you can do this, it makes such a world of difference, especially when it comes to getting readers excited to pick up your book. And that third element is that you can describe your story in one compelling sentence, in a way that provokes immediate interest. So what I'm talking about here is your premise. And your goal to aim for should be, if somebody heard my premise, then they got distracted by whatever else, would they find themselves still thinking about the book days later? And would that then motivate them to pick up a copy and see what happens? This is such a great test to determine the strength of your story idea. Consider the following stories. First of all, we have Replay by Ken Grimwood. The premise of this is a 43-year-old man dies and wakes up in his 18-year-old body 25 years back in the past. Another example, Pilgrims by M.R. Leonard. Aliens arrive on Earth and reveal themselves as Catholic. And then lastly, Skull Sworn by Brian Staveley. To pass a trial, an assassin priestess has 10 days to fall in love and then kill her lover. If you're anything like me, these premises make you insanely curious to know what happens next. They are clearly strong story ideas. And that's because they just provoke immediate curiosity and immediate questions. What is the middle-aged man going to do with his second chance at life? Why are the aliens Catholic? How can the priestess possibly fall in love with someone who she plans to kill? Now, of course, at this point you might be thinking, but Jed, there are plenty of stories I've read where I absolutely love them, but I would never be able to properly describe them in just one sentence. And I agree with you. There are plenty of amazing stories that can't be summed up in one sentence. But to me, that means these books, as good as they might be, actually have a weak concept. Remember, we're not talking about the execution of your ideas here in this video. We're just talking about the strength of your concept. Because while you can take a weak concept and produce a great book, that's always harder and always requires a lot more skill than just starting with a strong concept. And especially if you are a first-time author, you want your concept to be as strong as possible because it's how readers decide whether to grab your book. So how do you practically write a great one-sentence premise? Well, in my upcoming book, Plotting Your Fantasy Novel, I've actually got an entire chapter just dedicated to writing a great premise. And that's going to go into much more depth than I can in this video. You can go to jedherne.com/plot to join the waitlist if you want me to email you when that book is published in a couple of months. But to give you a quick overview here, your premise should basically tell us about your main characters, including any personality traits that make them interesting, their goals, what they are actually seeking in the story, some suggestion of their character arc or the journey they go on, sort of emotionally or mentally, the core conflict they face, and then the stakes, which should answer the question, why should I care about this? So to build your premise, just put down a few notes for each of these points I've described. Then you can use the following 5 premise formulas to arrange them into your actual premise. So the first formula here is inciting incident plus character plus goal. For instance, after a storm leaves him stranded on Mars, astronaut Mark Watney must survive alone while finding a way to signal Earth for rescue. That is The Martian by Andy Weir. Another formula, character plus goal plus setting. A woman who can see the dead seeks justice for an unsolved murder by unraveling the twisted secrets of Yale's magical societies. That is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. Another formula, character plus goal. A comfort-loving hobbit reluctantly agrees to help a wizard and a group of dwarves steal treasure from a dragon. That is The Hobbit. And you'll see here when I say character plus goal, it doesn't necessarily mean one character. Here I actually have a group of characters, right? We've got the Hobbit, and then we've got the dwarves, and we've also got Gandalf as well. And then another formula, character plus goal plus stakes. 6 criminal outcasts try to break into a military stronghold to free a hostage who could change the shape of magic forever. That is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. And then our last formula here is character plus inciting incident. An awkward teenager, that's our character, becomes Death's apprentice. That is Mort by Terry Pratchett. And again, I've got a whole chapter on premise writing and plotting a fantasy novel, so when that comes out, definitely read that chapter if you want to go a bit deeper with this. Once you have developed your premise, you can check to see if it's compelling by telling it to people in your life. I know this is really scary to do, but if you can tell your one-sentence premise to someone, and you can see them immediately perk up, or they start to ask you questions about what happens next, or they want to know more details about your story, then that is a really good sign that you are on to a strong story concept. Now, the fourth element of a great fantasy story idea is that your idea contains an intriguing contradiction. So to explain what this is and why this is so powerful, I want you to imagine two different story concepts, and you tell me which one you find more interesting. Our first story follows the strongest knight in the realm as he is tasked to slay a dangerous dragon. Our second story follows a pitifully weak painter's apprentice who is tasked with slaying that same dragon. Which concept feels more intriguing? It's probably the second one, and the reason is because this second concept contains an interesting contradiction. You've taken two things that don't feel like they go together, the painter's apprentice and slaying a dragon, and then you've combined them. And by doing so, your reader can immediately imagine the possible conflicts and character growth that we're going to see in that story. The most accomplished knight in the realm doesn't necessarily have to have a ton of growth in order to become brave enough to defeat that dragon. But if you're just like this painter's apprentice, defeating a dragon is in a completely different realm of existence for you. So there's going to have to be a lot of growth for that person to go through. And if we go back to one of the premises we discussed before, you can actually see how it's this same sense of contradiction that makes it feel interesting. So if we look at the premise for Skullsworn again, to pass a trial, an assassin priestess has 10 days to fall in love and then kill her lover, there is a fascinating contradiction baked into this description, which will generate a lot of conflict, struggle, and possibly growth for the characters involved. How is it possible for someone to fall in love with a person knowing that she's going to have to kill them? And that conflict piece there is particularly important because the best story ideas have meaningful conflict built into the concept. By presenting us with your one-sentence premise, we should be able to instantly understand what issues and problems your main character will have to deal with. And readers should be thinking, oh, that's a really interesting, difficult thing to grapple with. I'm very interested to see how that will get resolved. The fifth element of a great fantasy story idea is that your idea extends past the beginning of your story. This might sound a little bit confusing, but it's really important to get this right because I see writers go wrong with this all the time, usually without even noticing. To explain what I mean, take a look at this quote from the screenwriter Matt Bird. I run into this problem all the time. I come up with what I think is a great concept for a thriller, but then I realize my idea only provides a unique way of starting the movie. But all of the uniqueness disappears once the movie gets going. Keep this in mind with your own writing, because it's very easy to come up with a concept that gets readers in the door, but then vanishes from the story once things get underway. For instance, let's say your protagonist has the ability to hear people's thoughts, but only when they're lying. It's a cool concept, right? But if the main plot of your novel is about your protagonist trying to survive alone in the wilderness after a plane crash, then sure, maybe there might be one scene where she uses her lie detection abilities on another survivor, but mostly she's just by herself building shelters and hunting for food. And that's a problem because the concept that got us interested has nothing to do with the actual story. Now you might be wondering, okay, how would we fix this? Well, let's imagine your protagonist is a lawyer and she's been assigned to defend someone accused of murder. It looks like a sure thing, and she's reluctant to get on the case. But every time her client speaks, she hears nothing, which means he's telling the truth because she can hear people's thoughts when they're saying a lie. So she realizes, oh, this guy's actually innocent. But when the prosecution's star witness takes the stand, and maybe that star witness is some high-up authority figure, she can hear all of his thoughts. And so she realizes, oh, this witness is actually lying through his teeth. Now your protagonist has to figure out how to prove her client's innocence when she can't, exactly just come out and tell the judge, Your Honor, I have magical lie detecting powers, right? She has to use her ability, her special magical capabilities, to guide the investigation, interviewing different witnesses, interviewing suspects, listening for the different signs of deception, and slowly trying to piece together what's actually happened. Her power isn't a throwaway detail now, it's the engine that drives the entire plot forward because her power is all about uncovering lies, and the story is all about uncovering lies. There is fusion and there is synergy here. So it's really important that you make sure that your story idea is not just a gimmick to get readers in the door, but is actually meaningfully explored throughout your entire plot. Now, the next sign of a strong story idea is a bit different from the ones we've covered so far, but if you can get this right, it's going to be huge for making your fantasy story stand out from the crowd. And this sixth element is that you can bring some kind of unique expertise or emotional grounding to the story. I saw a great example of this recently with the astronaut Chris Hadfield. So for a bit of context, this guy has spent like 160 days in space, and he actually wrote a fiction book set in space called Final Orbit. That is awesome. Because my assumption, without having actually read this book, is that he's going to have so many details in that story that no other author could really have put down because he's actually lived it. So if you have some kind of unique life experience that you can draw from, this is just such a fantastic way to come up with a unique story idea. Now, of course, we can't all be astronauts. I know I'm still waiting for my acceptance letter from NASA, but there probably are some things in your life that you actually are an expert in, even if you don't realize this. And this doesn't just apply to particular subjects or jobs or hard skills. As Stephen King says, write what you like, then imbue it with life and make it unique by blending in your own personal knowledge of life, friendship, relationships, sex, and work. I can just about guarantee that there have been times in your life where you have felt supremely angry or incredibly in love or endlessly curious or absolutely terrified. And if you can find a way to bring that into your story idea, it's going to make your concept feel far more interesting and far more powerful. And then the seventh and final element of a great story idea is that you have a strong triangle of story. I define the triangle of story as being made up of character, plot, and setting, with theme as the intersection between all of those. And the best stories are constructed in a way where every element feels cohesively woven into the next. For example, it's impossible to think about Harry Potter, the character, without also thinking about Hogwarts, the setting, Harry discovering he's a wizard, a plot point, Voldemort, who is another character, Platform 9 3/4, the setting, Harry learning how to cast different spells, plot, Ron and Hermione, more characters, Harry, Ron, and Hermione exploring Hogwarts and uncovering the castle's secrets, which is plot and setting, and so forth. It all feels like this really well-crafted puzzle. All these different pieces and all the different points of the triangle of story fit perfectly together. The world building influences the plot, which influences the characters, who influence the world, and so forth. Now, the reason why this is so important to get right is because I see a lot of story ideas where the writer might have this incredible concept for their world building. But if that writer is then just tacking on characters or a plot that doesn't meaningfully interlinked or interact with that world building, then what you end up with is a sense of disconnection between the different elements of your concept, and the result is a weak story idea. Your story idea only becomes truly strong when there is a deep sense of connection between your plot, your characters, your setting, and your theme. In other words, you should feel like your plot is the perfect way to challenge your main character, and your character is the perfect person to explore your world, and your world is the perfect setting to explore the ideas of your theme, and so on. Now, once you've come up with a strong concept for your fantasy novel, you'll want to watch this video over here to learn my full process for building out the entire plot of your story. That video will help you actually take your concept and then write it in the most interesting way possible, helping you fill in any gaps in your plot so that you don't get stuck halfway through your first draft. Keep writing and keep striving, and I'll see you in the next video.